Picture this. You're standing in the marble corridors of a Roman villa at dusk, oil lamps casting dancing shadows on frescoed walls. Through thin fabric partitions, you hear whispered conversations between a Domina and her slave girls, planning tomorrow's beauty rituals. The air carries scents of rose oil, burning incense, and something else, something metallic and strange. A senator's wife emerges from her private chambers, her face painted with white lead, her lips stained crimson with mercury-based cosmetics that will slowly poison her over the years. She moves gracefully toward her husband's study, where important guests await, but her steps carry the weight of customs so alien to our modern sensibilities that they seem pulled from fever dreams rather than historical records. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What we call intimacy today, private moments between lovers, personal grooming habits, family relationships existed within a framework so radically different in ancient Rome that it challenges every assumption we hold about human nature. These weren't aberrations or exceptions to Roman life. They were woven into the social fabric, supported by law, religion, and custom, creating a civilization where power dynamics, gender roles, and human sexuality operated according to rules that would horrify and fascinate us in equal measure. In 79 AD, when Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii under volcanic ash, it preserved not just buildings and bodies, but evidence of intimate practices that Romans themselves often discussed only in whispers. Archaeological excavations have revealed bedrooms with explicit frescoes, bathhouses with intricate social hierarchies, and private spaces where the boundaries between pleasure, pain, and power blurred beyond recognition. Consider the Roman concept of pudicitia, often translated as chastity or modesty, but encompassing something far more complex. For a Roman woman, pudicitia wasn't simply about sexual purity. It was about maintaining the precise balance of availability and restraint that their social position demanded. A senator's wife needed to be sexually available to her husband, while remaining utterly inaccessible to other men, not from personal choice, but as a reflection of her husband's honor and political standing. Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus, mastered this balance so completely that she became the template for Roman feminine virtue. Yet behind closed doors, she allegedly maintained a network of informants among the slave girls of prominent families, gathering intelligence about the intimate habits of her husband's political rivals. She understood that in Rome, personal information was political currency, and bedchamber secrets could topple governments. Roman marriage itself operated on principles that seem almost businesslike in their calculated nature. Marriages among the elite were negotiations between families designed to consolidate wealth, forge political alliances, and produce legitimate heirs. Love, if it developed, was considered a pleasant bonus rather than a prerequisite. Wedding nights were often the first time couples met privately, and the pressure to consummate the marriage successfully could be overwhelming. Pliny the Younger, writing to a friend in 97 AD, described the wedding night of a young couple from prominent families. The girl, barely 14, trembled as her mother and aunts prepared her for the ceremony that would transform her from child to wife in a single evening. Her husband, 20 years her senior, waited in the adjoining chamber, while older women explained duties she could barely comprehend. The marriage bed had been blessed by the household gods, sprinkled with sacred water, and draped with fabrics dyed the precise shade of red that would hide the evidence of her virginity's end. Roman sexual customs recognized categories of human beings rather than simply male and female. Citizens, non-citizens, slaves, freedmen, and foreigners occupied different positions in an elaborate hierarchy that determined not just social status, but sexual roles and expectations. A Roman citizen man could engage sexually with slaves, prostitutes, or foreigners without social censure, but his interactions with the wives or daughters of other citizens were strictly regulated and potentially deadly. Gaius Silius discovered this distinction fatally in 48 when he married Valeria Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, while Claudius was away from Rome. Whether the marriage was legally valid mattered less than its symbolic challenge to imperial authority. When Claudius returned, both Silius and Messalina were executed, not primarily for adultery, but for threatening the political order through their sexual transgression. Slavery added another layer of complexity to Roman intimate life. Household slaves were considered extensions of their owners' bodies, available for sexual use without consent or legal protection. Wealthy Romans often maintained specialized slaves for different aspects of intimate life: cosmata for beauty treatments, cubiculari for bedroom service, and concubinae for ongoing sexual relationships that existed parallel to legal marriages. Marcus Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men in the 1st century BC, reportedly owned more than 500 slaves in his urban household alone. Among them were dozens of young men and women selected specifically for their physical beauty and trained in arts that extended far beyond domestic service. Roman writers of the period hinted at elaborate rituals within such households, even in gatherings where slaves performed not just music and poetry, but intimate services that blurred the lines between entertainment, worship, and sexual exploitation. Roman bathing culture created spaces where social and sexual boundaries operated according to carefully calibrated rules. Public bathhouses served as centers of social life, but they also functioned as venues for sexual encounters that ranged from subtle flirtation to explicit proposition. Men and women bathed separately in most facilities, but the social mixing that occurred in adjacent areas often led to arrangements that would be concluded privately. Seneca the Younger, writing around 60 AD, complained about the noise from a bathhouse beneath his apartment. The grunting of men lifting weights, the slapping of flesh during massages, the cries of those being depilated with tweezers, and beneath it all, the whispered negotiations between bathers and the attendants who offered services not advertised on any public notice. His irritation reveals a world where commercial sex was so integrated into daily life that it operated openly within public institutions. Roman depilation practices bordered on the obsessive, particularly among the upper classes. Both men and women removed body hair using methods that were often excruciating: heated tweezers, primitive waxes made from pine resin, and even pumice stones used to abrade hair from the skin. Wealthy Romans employed specialized slaves called alipulari, whose sole responsibility was hair removal using these brutal techniques. Martial, the Spanish-born poet writing in the 1st century A, described watching a senator's wife endure a depilation session. She lay motionless as her slave girl worked with heated bronze tweezers, removing each hair from her arms, legs, and more intimate areas while maintaining the stoic expression expected of a Roman matron. Tears ran silently down her cheeks, but she made no sound that might suggest weakness or complaint. The procedure took hours, and when finished, her skin was raw and bleeding but perfectly smooth, according to the fashion demanded by her social position. Cosmetics in ancient Rome often contained substances we now know to be deadly. White face paint made from lead carbonate gave upper-class women the pale complexion that signified wealth and leisure, but prolonged use led to lead poisoning, causing neurological damage, infertility, and death. Rouge made from mercury-based compounds produced beautiful red lips and cheeks while slowly destroying the nervous system. Kohl eyeliners contained antimony and other toxic metals. Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, written around 02 AD, provided detailed instructions for women's beauty routines that read like recipes for gradual suicide. Mix white lead with vinegar until it forms a smooth paste, then apply thickly to face and neck. For lips, crush cinnabar with rose oil and animal fat. Line the eyes with antimony mixed with honey and wine. Women following these instructions literally painted themselves to death over years or decades, pursuing beauty standards that demanded the sacrifice of health and longevity. Roman contraceptive and abortifacient practices relied on substances and procedures that were often more dangerous than the pregnancies they were meant to prevent. Silphium, a plant harvested to extinction from the coast of Libya, was so valued for its contraceptive properties that it appeared on Cairenian coins and sold for its weight in silver. Women consumed it in various preparations, but the plant's active compounds were so concentrated that overdoses frequently proved fatal. Soranus of Ephesus, a Greek physician practicing in Rome during the 2nd century, documented other contraceptive methods in his Gynecology. Some women inserted wool soaked in honey, cedar resin, or vinegar before intercourse. Others consumed mixtures of copper sulfate, iron rust, or crushed beetles. Still others attempted to prevent conception through violent exercise, hot baths, or deliberate falls. His clinical tone masks the desperation of women risking their lives to control their fertility in a society that offered them few legal or social alternatives. Abortion practices were even more dangerous. Roman law generally permitted abortion, viewing the fetus as part of the mother's body rather than a separate entity, but the procedures available were brutal and frequently lethal. Women consumed toxic plants like pennyroyal, rue, and savin, which induced miscarriages by poisoning the entire system. Others underwent mechanical procedures using bronze instruments that often caused hemorrhaging, infection, or internal injuries. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, completed around 77 of the, described observing a wealthy woman's attempt to terminate an unwanted pregnancy. She had consumed various herbs for days without effect, growing weaker and more desperate. Finally, she allowed a Greek physician to insert bronze instruments into her womb, while she bit down on a leather strap and her female relatives held her still. The procedure succeeded in ending the pregnancy, but infection set in. Within days, she died in agony, her family telling neighbors she had succumbed to a fever rather than admit the true cause. Roman attitudes toward homosexuality operated according to complex social codes that had little to do with emotional attraction and everything to do with power dynamics. Sexual relationships between men were acceptable and often celebrated, provided they respected hierarchical boundaries. A Roman citizen could take the active role with slaves, foreigners, or social inferiors without criticism, but being penetrated by another man, regardless of consent or desire, was considered deeply shameful and potentially criminal. Julius Caesar faced persistent rumors throughout his career about his alleged passive relationship with Nicomedes IV of Bithynia during his youth. Political enemies referred to him as the Queen of Bithynia, suggesting that his military conquests were attempts to compensate for this perceived sexual humiliation. Whether the accusations were true mattered less than their power to damage his reputation. In Roman culture, being sexually dominated was incompatible with political authority. Emperor Hadrian's relationship with the beautiful youth Antinous scandalized some contemporaries not because it was homosexual, but because Hadrian's obvious emotional attachment suggested he had surrendered the dominant position expected of a Roman ruler. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130 AD, Hadrian's grief was so overwhelming that he deified the young man and founded a city in his honor, acts that many Romans viewed as undignified displays of romantic weakness. Roman prostitution operated within legal frameworks that recognized different categories of sex workers with varying rights and social positions. Meretresses were registered prostitutes who worked in brothels and paid taxes on their earnings. Ancilla were slave women whose owners rented out their sexual services. And prostibulae were women of higher social classes who have lost their respectability through adultery or other scandals and had fallen into informal prostitution. Brothels in Pompeii, preserved by volcanic ash, revealed the working conditions of ancient sex workers. Rooms were tiny stone cubicles barely large enough for a narrow bed, with explicit frescoes on the walls depicting various sexual acts and prices. Graffiti left by clients includes names, crude reviews, and occasionally expressions of genuine affection for particular women. One inscription reads, "Restituta, you have such a sweet way of moving your hips," suggesting that even in commercial transactions, human connections sometimes emerged. The Subura district of Rome housed the city's largest concentration of brothels, taverns, and entertainment venues. Wealthy men would visit in disguise, wearing common clothes and covering their faces to avoid recognition. Juvenal, writing around 100 AD, described senators and even priests frequenting these establishments. They arrive after dark, their togas exchanged for rough tunics, their senatorial rings hidden in purses. By dawn, they return to their villas and their public virtues, as if the night's activities existed in a separate world governed by different gods. Marriage contracts among wealthy Romans often included detailed provisions about sexual behavior that sound more like business agreements than romantic partnerships. These documents, preserved on papyrus and bronze tablets, specified not just property arrangements, but behavioral expectations, including frequency of sexual contact, acceptable forms of contraception, and penalties for various forms of adultery. A marriage contract from 134 AD between two prominent Roman families includes this clause: "The wife shall submit to her husband's sexual demands no fewer than twice weekly, unless prevented by illness, menstruation, or religious purification. She shall not refuse unusual requests unless they cause physical injury or require the presence of additional parties. Failure to comply shall result in financial penalties deducted from her dowry." Roman wedding nights often involved elaborate rituals designed to ensure fertility and marital harmony. The bride was carried across the threshold to prevent evil spirits from entering through her feet. Her hair was arranged with a spear that had killed a gladiator, symbolizing the courage she would need in childbirth. The marriage bed was blessed by matrons who had been married only once and had living children, while young boys scattered nuts and fruits to encourage fertility. Catullus, in his wedding song for Unia and Manlius around 60 BC, described the ceremony that preceded the couple's first night together. The bride sits silently as older women remove her childhood clothes and dress her in the saffron gown of marriage. Her face is painted with sacred clay, her hair bound with ribbons blessed by the household gods. She weeps not from sadness, but from terror of the unknown transformation that awaits her. The groom waits in the adjoining chamber, drinking wine with his male relatives who offer advice both crude and tender about the duties he must perform before dawn. Roman divorces among the upper classes could be initiated by either spouse simply by declaring the marriage ended. But the social and financial consequences varied dramatically by gender. Men who divorced their wives faced few penalties and could remarry immediately. Women who divorced faced social ostracism, potential loss of their children, and significant financial hardship, since Roman law generally favored husbands in property disputes. Augustus attempted to regulate marriage and divorce through his Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus in 18 BC, requiring men to marry and penalizing those who remained bachelors or divorced without cause. The law backfired spectacularly, creating a black market in fake marriages and encouraging wealthy Romans to find creative ways around its requirements. Some men married slave women they immediately freed, while others arranged marriages with foreigners who lived in distant provinces and were never seen again. Roman religious festivals often included elements that modern audiences would find shocking in their explicit sexuality. The Floralia, celebrated each April in honor of the goddess Flora, featured nude dancing, theatrical performances with graphic sexual content, and public coupling that was believed to encourage agricultural fertility. Respectable married women typically avoided the festival, but prostitutes, slaves, and freedwomen participated enthusiastically. Martial described attending the Floralia in 88a, the theater filled with citizens who would condemn such displays in their private homes, but cheered wildly as naked dancers performed acts that would scandalize a brothel. Senators sat beside slaves, all pretending that religious duty rather than prurient curiosity had brought them to witness performers coupling on stage while musicians played sacred hymns. The goddess Flora was said to bless those who honored her with complete abandonment of modesty, and the crowd seemed determined to earn her favor. Roman medical texts reveal attitudes towards sexuality that mixed practical knowledge with cultural assumptions about gender and power. Physicians like Galen wrote detailed descriptions of human anatomy and sexual function, but their recommendations often reflected social hierarchies rather than medical facts. They believed that women needed to experience sexual pleasure to conceive, but also that excessive pleasure could make them immoral and uncontrollable. Soranus of Ephesus provided guidance for midwives attending births that reveals how Romans understood the connection between sexuality and reproduction. If labor proceeds slowly, the midwife should inquire whether the woman achieved satisfaction during the conception, as pleasure opens the womb and encourages the child's descent. If she did not, the birth may require additional intervention through herbs or manipulation. Women who conceive through rape or duty often have difficult labors, while those who conceive in passion deliver more easily. Roman sexual education for young people operated through a combination of direct instruction and cultural absorption that began early and continued throughout adolescence. Boys learned about sexuality from older male relatives, tutors, and through direct experience with slaves. Girls received instruction from their mothers and other married women, but their education focused primarily on submission and endurance rather than pleasure or choice. Coming-of-age ceremonies for Roman boys included ritualistic elements that marked their transition from childhood to sexual maturity. The toga virilis ceremony, typically held when boys turned 16, included sacrifices to the household gods, public declarations of manhood, and private instructions about sexual behavior. Archaeological evidence suggests these private instructions often included visits to brothels or arranged encounters with experienced slaves. Roman poetry provides glimpses into the emotional lives of people navigating these complex sexual and social expectations. Catullus wrote passionately about his love affair with Lesbia, probably Clodia Metelli, sister of a prominent politician, describing both ecstatic pleasure and devastating jealousy. His poems reveal that despite social conventions that treated love as secondary to marriage, Romans experienced the same intense emotions that characterize human relationships across cultures and centuries. Yet even Catullus' passionate poetry reflects Roman assumptions about gender and power. He celebrates Lesbia's intelligence and wit, but when their relationship sours, his language becomes violent and misogynistic. He threatens to rape and sodomize her male lovers, using sexual domination as a weapon against emotional injury. Love and power were so intertwined in Roman culture that even the most tender relationships could quickly turn brutal when social hierarchies were challenged. Roman funeral practices included elements that revealed how intimacy and sexuality were understood to continue beyond death. Wealthy families commissioned elaborate tomb monuments that depicted married couples reclining together, often with the wife's hand on her husband's chest in a gesture of eternal fidelity. These monuments were intended to reassure viewers that death could not sever the bonds created through sexual and emotional union. Some tombs included more explicit imagery that suggested Romans believed sexual pleasure would continue in the afterlife. Archaeological excavations have revealed burial chambers decorated with erotic frescoes and filled with objects clearly intended for intimate use. Whether these represented hopes for posthumous pleasure or simply reflected the deceased's earthly interests remains debated among scholars. Roman attitudes toward aging and sexuality differed significantly from modern Western assumptions. Older men were expected to remain sexually active throughout their lives, and wealthy Romans often married much younger wives specifically to ensure continued sexual satisfaction. Older women faced different expectations. Widows were encouraged to remarry for social and economic reasons, but postmenopausal women who displayed sexual interest were often mocked as inappropriate or desperate. Juvenal satirized older women who pursued younger men. Hippia, grandmother of 7, abandoned her husband to follow a gladiator to Egypt, her wrinkled face painted like a young bride's, her sagging body draped in silk that fooled no one. The gladiator took her money and her jewelry, but when she reached for him in their lodgings, he turned away in disgust, muttering that some coins cost too much to earn. Roman slavery created intimate relationships that existed in a legal and emotional limbo. Slaves could not legally marry, but they formed deep emotional bonds that were recognized informally within households. Masters sometimes freed beloved slaves to marry them, but such relationships remained complicated by the power dynamics that had created them. Children born to slave women belonged to their masters regardless of paternity, creating families that could be separated at will. Pliny the Younger wrote to a friend about his deceased slave, Zosimus. "He was more than a servant to me. He was a companion who shared my bed, my meals, and my confidences. When he fell ill, I nursed him myself rather than leave him to other slaves. His death has left an emptiness in my household that no replacement can fill. I have freed his son and arranged for a tomb that names Zosimus as my beloved friend rather than my property, though I know some will consider this excessive sentiment for a mere slave." Roman law recognized several forms of marriage with different legal implications. Confarreatio was the most formal ceremony, reserved for patricians and including elaborate religious rituals that made divorce extremely difficult. Coemptio involved a symbolic purchase that transferred the bride from her father's authority to her husband's. Usius created marriage through cohabitation. If a woman lived with a man for a full year without being absent for 3 consecutive nights, they were considered legally married. These different forms of marriage created a spectrum of intimate relationships with varying degrees of legal protection and social recognition. Wealthy families often arranged conferiatio marriages for their children to ensure maximum legitimacy and inheritance rights, while poorer citizens relied on usus marriages that required no ceremony or documentation but offered fewer legal protections. Roman sexual practices included behaviors that were considered normal within the culture, but seemed bizarre or disturbing to modern audiences. Pederasty, sexual relationships between adult men and adolescent boys, was accepted and often celebrated, provided it followed specific social rules. The adult was expected to take the active role and serve as the boy's mentor in intellectual and cultural matters. These relationships were seen as educational rather than exploitative, though a modern understanding of child development makes clear that they involved inherent power imbalances and potential psychological harm. Roman literature preserves detailed accounts of such relationships. Petronius, in his Satyricon written around 60 AD, described the narrator's complex feelings about his young lover, Giton. The boy's beauty tormented me more than it satisfied me. I wanted to possess him completely, to own not just his body, but his thoughts and dreams. Yet when other men looked at him with desire, I felt not pride but terror that someone might steal what I had claimed. Love and ownership became indistinguishable, and I could no longer tell whether I was Giton's protector or his captor. Roman religious practices sometimes included sexual elements that were believed to ensure divine favor or protection. Certain temples employed sacred prostitutes who served as intermediaries between worshippers and deities. The cult of Cybele, popular among soldiers and merchants, included rituals where male priests castrated themselves in religious ecstasy, then lived as women serving the goddess. These Galli occupied a unique social position, neither male nor female, neither citizen nor slave, but holy beings who existed outside normal categories. Roman magical practices often focused on sexual attraction and control. Archaeological sites have yielded numerous curse tablets requesting divine intervention in romantic matters. I bind Gaius Lucius so that he can think of nothing but Claudia, so that he cannot eat or sleep or find peace until he comes to her bed. Love potions made from various animal and plant ingredients were widely sold and consumed, despite laws against their use. The distinction between medicine, magic, and poison was often unclear, and many Romans died from consuming substances intended to enhance their sexual appeal or performance. Roman attitudes towards sexual pleasure differed significantly for men and women. Men were expected to pursue pleasure actively and were rarely criticized for sexual indulgence, provided they maintained their dominant social position. Women were supposed to experience enough pleasure to ensure conception, but not so much that they became uncontrolled or unfaithful. This delicate balance created anxiety for many women, who feared that showing too much or too little sexual interest might bring social censure or personal danger. Ovid's Amoris, written around 15 BC, includes this passage. She lay beneath me like a statue, performing her duty but showing no pleasure, fearing that passion might mark her as wanton. Yet when I ceased my efforts, she wept, believing her coldness had failed to please me. Roman wives must navigate between the Scylla of excessive desire and the Charybdis of insufficient response, and many wreck on one shore or the other. Roman household management included detailed oversight of slave sexual behavior. Masters could forbid slave marriages, separate slave families, and use sexual access to slaves as rewards or punishments. Some households maintained detailed records of slave breeding programs designed to produce children with specific physical or intellectual traits. These records, preserved on papyrus and wax tablets, read like livestock inventories and reveal how completely Romans had dehumanized the people they owned. Roman military culture included sexual practices that reflected both the homosocial nature of army life and the power dynamics between conquerors and conquered. Soldiers were expected to remain celibate during campaigns, but this rule was frequently violated through rape, concubinage, and relationships with local women. Victory celebrations often included the mass rape of female captives, which was considered a natural rite of conquest rather than a war crime. Caesar's commentary De Bello Gallico hints at these practices. After the siege of Alesia, the legions celebrated their victory according to ancient custom. The captured women were distributed among the officers and men, some to serve as servants, others for purposes that military discipline usually forbade, but victory temporarily permitted. The screams from the camp that night mingled with songs of triumph, creating a music that spoke of Rome's dual nature as both civilizer and destroyer. The vast scope of Roman life saw these intimate norms embedded in every facet of society. Urban planning reflected assumptions about sexuality and gender, with public buildings having separate entrances and private homes designed with strict hierarchies. Roman roads facilitated not just armies, but also the movement of prostitutes and entertainers. The legal system regulated sexual behavior to maintain social order, and the tax system generated significant revenue from licensed sexual commerce. Architectural innovations like private chambers and bathhouses were designed to accommodate sexual activities. Artistic traditions, from frescoes to sculptures, depicted explicit sexual acts that were acceptable household decorations. Philosophical traditions grappled with questions of pleasure and self-control, with Stoics advocating moderation and Epicureans a more nuanced acceptance of pleasure. Every corner of the empire, from its economic systems and technological innovations to its colonial policies and religious syncretism, was permeated by these complex and often brutal rules of intimacy. Now picture yourself back in that marble corridor where we began. But this time, you understand what those whispered conversations really meant. Those beauty rituals slowly poisoning aristocratic women. Those marriage contracts treating human intimacy like livestock breeding. Those slaves whose bodies were considered property to be bought, sold, and used without consent. You see those children married off before they understood what marriage meant, and you feel the weight of those elaborate social codes that determined who could touch whom, how, and when. Roman civilization gave us roads, laws, literature, and architectural marvels that still inspire admiration today. But it also created systems of human intimate relationships built on foundations of inequality, exploitation, and violence that we struggle to comprehend. The Romans weren't monsters. They were human beings operating within cultural frameworks that seemed natural and inevitable to them, just as our own sexual customs seem natural and inevitable to us. The volcanic ash that preserved Pompeii also preserved a mirror that reflects back to us the uncomfortable truth that human sexuality has always been shaped by power, politics, and social hierarchies. Those Romans lying in their final positions, their intimate lives frozen in time, remind us that the distance between their world and ours might be smaller than we'd like to believe. We've simply become more sophisticated at hiding the transactions, the inequalities, and the violence that still shape our most private moments. Their ghosts whisper to us from across the centuries, not in Latin, but in the universal language of human desire complicated by human cruelty. They remind us that intimacy has never been innocent, that love has never been free from power, and that every culture's sexual customs reveal its deepest values about who counts as fully human and who doesn't. Standing in those ruins today, you can almost hear the echo of those ancient whispers, carrying secrets that were buried but never truly died. They just learned to speak in different languages and hide behind different customs, as persistent and troubling as the human heart itself.